feel free to turn off your video and also feel free to mute yourself. I'm going to put some live transcriptions on so that people can read along with it. But thank you so much for coming. This is the third part of our installment of our ground floor symposium, Chicago as ground floor. And this part is Chicago as research. We've had a really great conversation series with artists from Chicago on mentorship, on whether or not people should take an MFA, a BFA, or if they're doing unconventional schooling, like our center program as well, and just getting insight from artists on different backgrounds and the work that they're doing and creating and making in the city that we know and love. Ground Floor is a biennial that we're doing at the Hyde Park Arts Center, and it features 5 MFA programs from artists at schools like University of Chicago, the School of the Art Institute, and amongst others. But we really are grateful to be able to support this program and offer a space for emerging artists to be able to showcase their work, especially after a year like 2020, where a lot of them didn't get to have that major exhibition for their graduation or anything like that. So it's been a great opportunity to be able to support that work in a different capacity. So we're excited to dive in. I want to tell you a bit about our speakers who will be joining us here today. We have 3 wonderful panelists who will be talking about their work in Chicago and how Chicago's rich history of political organizing, activism, and experimentation has really impacted their work and their practice as well. We have, as I'm reading them, I'm going to share these slides so that you can see a bit about who they are and what they're doing as well. With me. 1 second. So we have Bun Stout, a Chicago-based artist using sculpture, fashion photography, and augmented reality to investigate beauty's role in the power structures developing at the entrance to the digital age. These artworks are tools for reimagining social realities, actualizing futures both feared and desired in the here and now. Stout's ongoing work is an ever-growing lending library of wearable sculptures designed for near-future drag family. These include mixed reality wearables made from acrylic, silicone, and augmented reality software. These dystopian accessories and garments then go out to performers in the Chicago area. The looks emanate from the world of queer club fashion and are tools for reimagining current physical and social realities, using the concreteness of art, make not yet realized fashions and potential futures appear in the present. The finished work spirals out. One part is the physical and digital wearable sculptures. Part is their incorporation into works by queer and trans performers. And finally, another part is the transformation enacted in the process. Wearing these looks generates confidence and or complication, highlighting the mutability of identity and asking wearers and viewers to shift perspectives into a very near potential future. This body of work continues to grow as more pieces are made and existing pieces circulate to become engaged in new looks, images, and performances. So everyone, please welcome Bun to our chat here.
Hello.
Then we also have Tiff Beatty. Tiffany L. Beatty, also known as Tiff, is an arts and culture organizer and spoken word poet in Chicago, Illinois. She was born and raised in Tacoma, Washington. Tiff Beatty writes, performs, organizes, and hosts Chicago's only Bonfire cipher, Art is Bonfire. As program director of arts, culture, and public policy at National Public Housing Museum, she oversees the museum's public programs and events, including the Oral History Project and Entrepreneurship Hub. In 2020, she co-created Just Action Racial Equity Collaborative as a Chicago United for Equity Senior Fellow. She previously served as Director of Programming at the Chicago Humanities Festival, as well as the Chicago Center for Urban Life and Culture. Her social justice and activism programs and poetries are featured in Ebony Magazine and the Chicago Tribune. Beatty was a 2019 Fellow with Chicago United for Equity and received the additional distinction of 2019 Field Leader Award from the Field Foundation of Illinois. So everyone, please welcome Tiff Beatty. Awesome. And then we have William Estrada, last but not least. And if you could remember to please mute yourself so that we can make sure that we can hear everyone. Okay, there we go. Thank you. So William Estrada grew up in California, Mexico, and Chicago. His teaching and art making practice focuses on addressing inequity, migration, historical passivity, and cultural recognition in historically marginalized communities. He documents and engages experiences in public spaces to transform, question, and make connections to established and organic systems through discussion, creation, and amplification of stories through creativity already present. He is currently a visual art teacher at Telpokali. I hope I pronounced that right. Forgive me, William. Elementary and faculty at the School of Art and Art History at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He has worked as an educator and artist with Chicago Arts Partnership in Education, Hyde Park Art Center, Sky Art, Marwin Foundation, Urban Gateways, DePaul University's Connect program, Graffiti Institute, Vermont College of Art and Design, the Prison and Neighborhood Art Project, and the School of the Art Institute. Everyone, please welcome William as well. And with that, I'm going to share some slides and images of their work, and they're going to introduce a little bit about their practice so that you all can get to know before we dive into the Q&A. So I'm going to share my screen so that you can see a bit of their work. So these are our three speakers today. And first up, we have Bun.
Hi. My name is Bun Stout. I'm one of the artists in the current ground floor exhibition at the Hyde Park Art Center. In short, my practice is making wearable things from an imaginary future. So it's tied really closely with the drag and queer nightlife communities here in Chicago. The practice is interdisciplinary. I use physical and digital media to try and imagine some potential futures of these communities and tell stories about those futures. Pre-pandemic, this mostly looked like club and drag wearables and garments that were using augmented reality, like the one that you see right now. In the last year, it involves wearables for digital fashion images and drag video performance, which is mostly how the community continues to gather. I'm also engaged with how drag as an industry and queer parties operate as this alternative financial ecosystem for trans and non-binary people, and how at the intersection of nightlife and art, there's this network of mutual aid for this underemployed but really often referenced group of cultural workers.
Thank you so much for sharing, Bun. And next up we have Tiff.
All right, can everyone hear me okay? Just a yes.
I can hear
So
you.
I know okay.
Yes.
I need that feedback, which kind of goes into my introduction. I'm a spoken word performer and cultural organizer, and you see one of my events on the screen that I want to talk about. But yeah, I have a number of hats, but this position as a performer and poet is really the position that I've held the longest. Pretty much since college, I started sort of experimenting with poetry and performance. And then I moved to Chicago. I'm originally from Tacoma, Washington, moved to Chicago. And that's really when I, quote unquote, found my voice, attending the open mics pretty much at that time, every night of the week. We were going to open mics. And eventually in 2011, I actually started my own event called Artist Bonfire. It still happens every summer, every last Sunday of the month, June through September at Promontory Point in Hyde Park, which is my first and favorite neighborhood aside from Bronzeville, where I live now. So yeah, this event is a free event in every sense of the word. It's time for people to come together and really just share poems, stories. We make s'mores and burn stuff. And it's just always good energy and being in the park, sitting around a fire, burning and building. I also collaborate a lot with my partner, my life partner, Jen Freeman, aka Pochop, who also is a burlesque artist and a creator of Reimagined Space. So she's created a couple of quote unquote praise and worship services, like Thank the Lord, which was inspired by the life and work of Black lesbian mother, warrior, poet Audre Lorde, and had a 3-night run at the Lookout as a part of the Lookout series at Steppenwolf, and also the People's Church of the Ghetto, which is on the screen now. So I basically wrote a poem that really talked about the history of our neighborhood, which is Bronzeville. We were both raised in church, and so it was an opportunity to draw on that history and sort of reimagine what would it look like to dedicate a service or praise and worship celebrating Black women's legacies, Black feminism or womanism. And so the artists like Jackie Orms, who's a cartoonist who lived in Bronzeville for a while, as well as activists like Beauty Turner, who actually was one of the first activists that I met when I moved here to Chicago. She's an activist and journalist who's passed now, rest in peace, but she was a journalist for the Robert Taylor Homes, and she was also a resident, which connects nicely to my current position, which I'm the Program Director of Arts, Culture, and Public Policy at the National Public Housing Museum, also known as NPHM. We're the only cultural institution in the nation dedicated to telling the stories of people of public housing. So we're part of an international coalition of sites of conscience, which means we believe in the power of place and memory to help us connect the past and to contemporary human rights issues. So beyond telling the story of people of public housing, we also talk about housing as a human rights issue and recognize the interconnected nature of housing with many other issues like health, education, economic issues, etc. Finally, I'm a Chicago United for Equity Senior Fellow for Narrative Design, which basically means I help tell the story of CUE, which is Chicago United for Equity's acronym. I help tell the story of CUE's citywide impact projects, including People's Budget Chicago, a participatory independent research project working with Chicago's most disinvested communities to educate people about the city budget and demand the basic things our communities need to be safe and thriving, like more money for housing and education, but also a more equitable and transparent budget process. I also am a co-creator of the Just Action Racial Equity Collaborative, which is committed to supporting the ongoing racial justice organizing happening in Chicago institutions by co-creating a shared language and a toolkit for accountabilities with communities of practice focused on shifting power through narratives, but also money and policy. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. And then next up, we have William.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Bun and Tiff, I'm like super honored to be sharing the space with you all. I'm super excited to be learning about your work. My name is William Estrada. I'm primarily an art educator and visual artist. The Mobile Street Art Cart started, I started doing street workshops in early 2002. I wanted to start engaging with people in the neighborhood about conversations that I was having in the classroom. As a classroom art teacher and teaching artist, I usually focus on thinking about cultural relevant art projects and thinking about how do we use art as a tool to amplify our stories, and thinking about art as a way to organize and mobilize specifically Brown and Black communities, right? And thinking about shifting the narrative of art as a luxury to art as a resilience and part of our long-standing legacies of people of color and marginalized spaces. The Mobile Street Art Cart was dreamt up because I was having these amazing conversations with kindergartners through 8th graders, and I found myself struggling to have those same conversations around race and power structures with adults. So, you know, in 2012, I was given the opportunity by 3 Arts Foundation, which is a Chicago arts organization, to create a 3 Arts project, a 3 AP project, to crowdfund a project of my choice. And you know, that's where the concept of the Mobile Street Art Cart came about. So, you know, I usually do probably about 60 to 70 workshops out in the streets, predominantly in Black and brown neighborhoods. And the mobile streetcar really stands to honor the mobile vendors that we find in multiple communities across Chicago and around the world that really are the cultural ambassadors, where people come together and celebrate each other, in the essence of restoring legacies and passing on generational knowledge, but also really supporting each other, right? By providing the food and the resources that our communities need. And then in 2012, not 2012, I'm sorry, in 2014, from a conversation that I was having with my mother about the fact that we had migrated so much across different cities and countries, and the fact that we didn't have necessarily a lot of family photographs that really documented our history, the mobile family portrait project came about, right? So the family portrait project is really a mobile photo studio that started in the community of Lawndale, right? Like specifically thinking about North Lawndale and South Lawndale, which is more commonly known as Little Village, and thinking about providing free family portraits to Black and brown people, and thinking about restoring their legacies and claiming space, specifically as Chicago is experiencing and has been experiencing a great loss of Black and brown families, specifically Black families, and thinking about who gets to claim spaces, who gets to claim communities, and who gets to tell the stories of displaced families. So these archival images are, all the workshops, all the work is free to people in the neighborhood, but they're really there to amplify people's stories, to celebrate the legacies that go untold, and also for me as an artist, to learn about the complexities of the stories that exist in neighborhoods that I get to teach in, but don't always get the opportunity to learn with the people that are outside of the institutions and schools that I work with. And it gives me an opportunity to really get to know people that I might not otherwise interact with. But there are these creative disruptions and interactions, to our lives that center joy. So.
Thank you so much for sharing, William. You all are really doing amazing, amazing work, and we're really grateful to be able to showcase that. So let's dive into some questions and get to know them a bit further and more about their work and how they use Chicago as a place to inform their practice. And what's interesting about all of our speakers today is they're not from Chicago. So I would be curious to see what brought you here and why did you decide to stay? And particularly how you build trust and community in a new city, especially being so ingrained in the community like all of you all seem to be. Whoever wants to start.
Well, I was ready, and then you threw that second part in there.
You can just answer the first part. Let's talk about what brought you to Chicago and why did you stay?
Right? Yeah. But yeah, we can definitely go there. We can get there. I just wasn't ready. But yeah, that's a really good question. So I think, I know what brought me to Chicago was I was going to school in Spokane, Washington, which is in Eastern Washington. I'm originally from Western Washington, Tacoma area near Seattle. So if you know anything about Washington State, the Eastern and Western sides of the state are completely different. You're basically in a blue state on the West Coast and a red state on the other side of the mountains on the Eastern side. So I was going to school in this conservative white town, about 200,000 people, so decent size, but just, there were obviously people of color there, but they were mostly not accessible to me at my college. I went to a small private liberal arts school. And the relationships that we did have with the community as an institution, I didn't feel totally comfortable with. So I really wanted to, my senior year, study abroad, Chicago was about as far as I could afford, but also thinking about my future as a senior and what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to do something with community. I was a psychology major. I was doing a lot of organizing on campus, and I was just starting to do spoken words. I was trying to think about how can I bring together arts and community, and also this activism and organizing. And so Chicago, like someone just came to my campus and was like, hey, do you want to come to Chicago? And I was like, sure. It was just a recruitment program to do this internship and a seminar called Chicago Communities and Culture at an organization called Chicago Center for Urban Life and Culture. So it was just perfect for me, really. I can't claim like any brilliance in making the decision. It just really worked out. So I came here for a January term, actually did an internship at Deeply Rooted Theater. I think it's Deeply Rooted Productions, Dance Theater, something like that now. They've changed their name, but it was a really great experience just being connected to a African-American dance company that was doing contemporary dance, which was way out of my experience, but something that really challenged me and made me think about being an arts administrator, basically the first time I really thought about doing that. And so came back to Chicago to actually work for the Chicago Center. It was a year-long apprenticeship that I came back for. And ended up turning into, I have one of my fellow apprentices actually in the meeting, shout out Shane. But it was a life-changing experience. So what was meant to be a year is now turned into 14. And so it's just one of those things. I can talk a lot more about why, but I want to make sure I give everyone a chance to talk. And also that question about building trust, I think is
Yeah,
connected
that's
a
the
little bit.
second
So.
part about that.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing. Yeah, William, what brought you to Chicago?
I mean, I came to Chicago when I was probably about 9 years old. I come from a mixed status family, right? So like the plan was that my sister and I would come to Chicago because we had family here with my parents, so we could learn English for 2 years. And then once we learned English, we were going to move back to Mexico. And the running joke in my family is that I'm still trying to learn the language, and you know, um, once I master it, then I'll move back. But yeah, I mean, most of my professional life has been here in Chicago, although there's been multiple times where I get the tickle or the invitation to get pulled away to somewhere else, and I realized that Chicago is now like the place that I call home. But we moved. I realized, I was just talking to my family a couple months ago because I was doing, just research, and realized that I lived in like 9 different neighborhoods of Chicago, and went to, like 7 different elementary schools, so there isn't a particular neighborhood or, you know, yeah, outside of like the southwest side of Chicago that I can claim as my own. Um, and yeah, we'll get into working in neighborhoods that might not be our own, but that's how I came to be here.
It makes sense that your work is so mobile and that you are able to maneuver through multiple neighborhoods given your upbringing as well. So interested to dive into that a bit more. How about you, Bun? What brought you to Chicago?
I moved to Chicago in 2015. I had grown up outside Indianapolis, very rural area. At the time before I moved here, I was living in Southern Indiana in Bloomington, where I'd gone to school. I was living with my trans family, and we all were really not having a great time successfully being employed in Southern Indiana. So we decided that we were going to try and get out, and really it was we pooled our resources, and the furthest we could get was Chicago. So this is where we came, and it really has become such a home. There are so many opportunities that are available here that just weren't available where we were before. It's incredible to me what a different life it can be from somewhere that's a 3-hour drive away.
Yeah, definitely. No, I definitely understand that. And I'm thinking also, you all work really closely with, marginalized communities, LGBTQ communities, Black and Brown communities. And like, that's very important to build that trust and that comfortability to be able to do the work that you're doing. So I would love to hear you all talk a bit about how you build that trust, especially being in a new city or a city that isn't necessarily your home, but it has become your home. Definitely, if you could all talk a bit about that, I think it would be really great.
I think honestly, maybe I could start on that one because it kind of transitions from what I was saying. And kind of a funny anecdote, I was able to move to Chicago after I won an undergraduate fellowship from the Southern Graphics Council. And at the time I was making prints and portraits of queer Midwesterners and trans Midwesterners. And it's funny because it was actually at this conference that I first heard about your work, William, and learning about the art cart was one of the first times I learned about a project that really turned how I understood printmaking on its head. So I just wanted to share that with you as like related to how I came here and how I ended up doing the work that I was doing. But I've lived here for 5 years, and I feel like it's taken every one of those 5 years for me to find a place in a community, and it's been very intentional and it's been very much related to the art that I'm doing. So I definitely use art as a way to connect to people. I've always done portraits. I've always made wearables for people. I love working with drag because I get to engage with all these incredible performers and help to augment what they're doing with my own creative work. And I think that is how I found that trust in that place here in Chicago, is by trying to see how I can use my work to contribute something and add something to what other artists are doing here.
Yeah, that's great. Well, anyone else?
I'll jump in. Yes, so I'm identify as queer and also Black, mixed race Black, and coming to Chicago, I think like one of the things that saved me was finding my people here and actually building a family. Like literally, I was adopted by the Chicago like South Side poetry scene. Like I have a woman named Dina Dean who calls me her daughter and checks on me and feeds me, and like we have a relationship outside of poetry, which I realized is what the Chicago poetry scene is, especially the South and West Side scene. It's not just like showing up to open mics and going home. Like right before I got on this call, my best friend, who also I met at an open mic, years ago, called me and just talked about, or told me someone, I already knew this, but told me someone in the community just passed recently. And it was just one of those things where it's just like, it hurts like someone in my family passed, like it's that deep. And so that was one of the things that I realized is just like, it's real here, and it's the brilliance and the pain combined that just like, I couldn't turn away from, and just had to just be myself. And so like, there were a lot of, I think, opportunities for me to start an open mic and to just sort of like jump into the scene. But I really took my time and tried to think like, what could I uniquely contribute to the scene? And ended up doing the Artist Bonfire event as a one-time thing that ended up growing because people on the poetry scene were just like, we have to do a fire again. We have to do that bonfire cipher. We got to do some more. So it really was just like building with people and like just trying to contribute what I could to what I saw was happening.
Yeah, definitely. I think that Chicago is a great place to be able to build community, and the artist scene is so intertwined and combined. A lot of them are educators or teachers and working on the ground doing events or have a social practice as well. I'm not from Chicago either. I've been here for 7 years, so I definitely understand how it can reel you in, and you can just become so ingrained in a part of the community here. What about you, William?
I mean, I think for me was that the work first is that my own arts practice is still pretty new, right? Like I really started I really focused on teaching because teaching was the place where I really felt at home, right? And it wasn't until I realized and I accepted and fully embraced the complexities of what my art practice could look like, right? That I started moving out of the classroom and into the city, right? And thinking about who gets to experience joy through art making, right? I think art making tends to be hierarchical, right? It tends to be um, siphoned, right, into spaces or institutions that aren't always welcoming, or people do not feel welcomed, you know. And I think part of the work that I was interested in doing and exploring more was, you know, how do we remind, right? You know, specifically, you know, working class neighborhoods and neighborhoods that are robbed of resources. How do we remind them of the joy of play, the joy of contemplation and making as a way to celebrate ourselves and honor the stories and the complexities of our experiences, but then also, you know, how do we get to um, you know, provide this moment of fortitude and silence and just like tinkering and playing with things, right? And I think part of that is also like the opportunity for me to learn, right? For me to learn and, you know, share, right? The multiple possibilities of building community in these temporary spaces that then, you know, that then give fruit to other relationships, right? Because I get to learn about the neighborhoods that I'm in, that I get invited into. And I think it's these like slow relationships that are slowly being developed and fed.
No, I just typed, I love that, the fruit of that as well too. And I really believe that neighborhoods in Chicago and the different place. I mean, if you go to a different neighborhood, it can feel like you're in a completely different city as well too. And like thinking about how we build trust in one area would be completely different from another area as well too. So I'm really curious about, just in general, now that we've talked a bit about you all coming to Chicago and the work that you've been able to do in building trust, specifically, how has Chicago influenced your practice or your career? And what are some things that have been very Chicago centric that have had an impact on how your work or practice has evolved? Feel free to take some time to think also.
I got one. I think so I talked about being a spoken word artist and kind of hinted at like how that's bridged into or intersected with organizing. And I think that is something very uniquely Chicago and very powerful about Chicago, not only how active artists are, but also how creative organizers are and how those communities really feed each other, especially again, thinking about the South Side and West Side and Black communities, especially around issues like police violence and other really issues that are life or death for Black people in the city specifically, and thinking about how those are strategies for survival, but also for, I think William talked about joy. And one specific example, actually, I was working at Chicago Humanities Festival at the time, and I had invited Alicia Garza to come and speak. And she was just going on and on about how she has an organizing crush on Chicago. And I just thought that was so cute, but also like it just happened to be the same weekend that I believe it was Assata's daughters were doing a protest, and they had been inspired by Beyonce's Formation, and they had like the whole outfits, and they were shutting down Lakeshore Drive, and it was just beautiful. I was just so proud to be from Chicago that day. And yeah, it's just been really the legacy of my career. It's just organizers coming to me and telling me how they see I can be useful to the cause, and for me just showing up and bringing my gifts and talents and being open and listening to what exactly it is that the community needs.
Yes to showing up and yes to listening to the needs of a community. I think oftentimes, especially in conversations around like gentrification or inserting yourself in a different community, it's important. And that's another question I have about working in tandem with communities. But continuing with this question about Chicago and the practice, William, how about you?
I mean, Chicago's dope. It's kind of like some dope ass people, like it's just like that, right? Like, I mean, oh my goodness, like the historical representations of folks organizing for their neighborhoods, for their families, right? Like there's generations and legacies, right, that exist in the streets, right? And in even within institutions, right, that have been formed with like the blood and sweat of people in their neighborhoods, and it's a constant reminder of the work that has been, you know that has been done in order for us to be here, right? And for our work to even exist. And also a reminder that the work still needs to, there's still so much work to do, right? That folks are doing at the ground level, organizing, with people in their neighborhoods. Um, but also the thing too with Chicago is that, like Chicago loves you really hard, but it will call you out on your shit in a second, right? Be like, wait. Like, what did you just say? Like, that was not you, right? Like, let's recognize where that work really exists, and that's the thing about the city, right? That like the people are the ones that are constantly, reminding us to dream bigger, right? Like to work a little bit harder and to rest as well, right? So, but Chicago is amazing, right? Like the people are the one that are, specifically, like all the work that, Black women have been doing in the city, right? That is constantly guiding, right? And reminding us, right, of the work that needs to be done.
Yes, that Chicago will definitely call you out, but it'll also hug you right after. It's one of those places. How are you, Bun?
I think artistically, there's this kind of status quo of collaboration in Chicago, which is really incredible and really blew my mind when I first came here. Um, we're not on either of the coasts. I think that a lot of people come to Chicago looking for opportunities from other places, and I think there's this kind of understanding here that when we put our powers together, we can make something that is so much greater than the sum of anyone's parts. Um, and I found that it's so common here for people to throw in their effort, to put in whatever creative ideas, energy, resources they have to try and do these projects that take them way beyond what they're capable of doing on their own. Um, and it's incredible. I love leading these projects, and I also love having the opportunity to contribute to these projects. And I think that as an artist, it's an incredible gift to be able to grow by participating in the artworks and in the efforts and in the activism of all these other people, and getting a chance to be a part of something that is so much bigger.
Yeah, definitely. And you did bring up a point that I wanted to talk about, also about collaboration and how important that is to the lifeblood of Chicago also. And really thinking about different people collaborating with one another, whether it be different artists or institutions. How is collaboration impacted your practice, and why do you think it's important? Also in like building trust, also in that conversation, working with other people to bring you in onto projects, listening to what people need and want to hear or experience in their communities. Have you had success with collaborations, or have you had any mishaps with collaborations also?
I think since I work a lot with nightlife, collaboration is this opportunity for really magical things to happen. And it's also this really slippery slope of people working for free. And it becomes this balancing act, which is really important to me and really important to the way that I make my work, to understand how creative energy is used, how it needs to be compensated. Um, when people work together, like what can we collectively gain from working together? What happens that causes people to be used or to have their energy basically used for someone else's profit? Um, so often the same language that's employed by artists who are working together to create a more in-depth project is also employed by businesses or club owners to get queens and artists to do free work that then like comes to benefit an industry basically. And that's something that I'm always negotiating here in the city when we talk about collaboration.
Yeah, and I think so much of your work is about collaboration also outside of the issue of labor, like thinking about labor, but the fact that your garments or projects are brought into like a completely second life through the collaborative work that you're doing. How do you find the people that you work with? Do you have like, how do you introduce yourself to the communities in the queer nightlife scene? Like what was the impetus behind that coming to? Were you going to a lot of clubs when you first moved here? Did you already have community of people that you knew? Kind of talk a bit about that.
Sure. No, I really didn't know anyone at all in the city when I moved here. I did move with my queer family. There were 4 of us. We knew each other. That was it. We jumped in. The first year, I didn't go to any clubs at all or any kind of like queer events really, even though I really wanted to, because I was really broke and I didn't understand yet. Like I didn't know like where those networks were and where those communities were happening except for bars. But the longer that I was here, the more I was able to connect with people through artwork. So I first by doing portraits and then by creating wearables is actually how I met the network that I'm a part of now. Started working with drag kings and queens, different performers, and by wearing my own looks to the clubs, eventually I did start going a lot, wearing the looks and using that as a way to engage with other people.
Yes. And what about you, William? I know that you came in at a point of teaching with your first foremost thought and incorporated that later into your practice. I know that teaching is a very collaborative effort and the point of like working with students, but the mobile art cart is just a highly collaborative project, and a lot of your projects are in collaboration with the people from the communities that you're interacting with.
I mean, collaboration, as a community-based artist, right? Like collaboration's always, it's tricky, right? Like it's extremely, there has to be a balance, right? Like in order to make sure that, everyone involved in the creation of whatever it is that we're attempting to create, like understands the relationships, and specifically in the, like I'll take for instance like the family portraits project, right? Like, thinking about the fact that, like yes, it's like my project, it's like my art piece, but the portraits themselves are not mine, right? Because those are owned by the people who are being photographed, right? Like the act itself is the work, not the photographs themselves, right? Because there is, there's a sense of like, oh look at how amazing I am because I'm photographing these people, right? And that's not the point of the project. The point of the work itself, the collaboration, is this the interaction becomes the actual performative piece, right? That is meant to celebrate the stories and the people. And if people want those photographs to exist outside of that experience, then I'll use them, right? Otherwise, like they don't exist, right? Like they get destroyed, right? Like the digital file gets destroyed. And then with a mobile street art card itself, like I don't go into neighborhoods that I'm not invited into, right? And when I go into neighborhoods, right, like there's usually a conversation about what the work, or in this case, like the prints or the buttons or whatever workshop that's going to happen in that neighborhood, what it's going to look like based on whatever is happening in the neighborhood and why I was invited, you know? But again, you know, like whatever work is generated, like my name is not on it, right? Like, and then once it goes out into the world, right? Like there's this co-ownership of the work itself, you know? And again, when it's being documented, right? Like I'll ask, right? Like, can I photograph you, right? Can I photograph your work of art? In order to kind of disrupt that like hierarchy of the artist, right? Because if we're collaborating, the ownership of the artifacts that are created, it like you and I own them, right? So if you don't want me to use them in outside of this particular space, then they won't get used.
Yes, I love that you also mentioned that you don't go to a neighborhood without being invited to a neighborhood as well. And are these people who have typically heard about your work or know who you are as an artist? Like, what is that ask generally like for you? And then do you come up with a concept together and decide what type of intervention or activation you'd like to do? Or is it a specific ask based upon something that they know you do?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes, you know, it's looked a little bit different in a couple of different ways, right? Like, you know, there has been times where I do residencies with institutions or museums, you know, and based on whatever prompt they're addressing, and whatever partnerships they have with communities, then, you know, that is centered, right? Other times it's really, you know, folks that see me, right, in the street, and they're like, hey, what is this? I know I've seen you a couple different times, right? Like, what do you do and how do you do that, right? And once I tell them, it's like, well, you know, this is like what I do, right? Like this is part of my art practice, then usually like people will reach out, right? Like people will either email me or they'll call me and be like, hey, there's this, you know, community festival, or this thing is happening in our neighborhood, and we know that you do like this political stuff with posters or buttons, like can you come and do something, you know? And depending on what it is, right, like sometimes there's prompts or designs that are generated to respond, or sometimes, you know, I just take material so people can respond, you know. But also like sometimes people don't want to respond to those prompts, so it's just about making, right? And how wherever people are at, however people want to engage, you know, it is fine as well.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for elaborating on that. What about you, Tiff? I know that the poetry community is ubiquitous in Chicago, and also your work with the Bonfire series is not just it's not necessarily a collaboration, but you're collaborating with the people who were there to share space and time also.
Right. And we have done some collaborations as well. And a lot of those have been folks just sort of coming to me and saying, we want to do this. Do you want to do it like together? Because you already kind of do bonfires. And I'm like, sure. And it's, you know, it's typically, like I said, so people who are already sort of connecting and in the community. And it is very, at least from my experience, very natural and organic, which is always a plus. And then I think on the other side, the experience that I have with collaboration is the institutional collaborations or partnerships, which I think can be a lot more challenging. I'm very thankful to be at the National Public Housing Museum because it's the first time I've really been at an institution that I think really thinks critically about the role of the institution and how to collaborate with communities in a way that really gives communities agency And the fact that, I mean, our museum is telling the story of an already marginalized group, we are already putting ourselves in a position of really having to wrestle with that power dynamic, and having to think really differently about how we approach our community, how we approach designing exhibits. And in a lot of ways, it's exciting because it really can be the 21st century museum that doesn't repeat the practices of the previous standards of museums and how those practices have happened. And I'm sure all the folks on this call are educated on that. But I mean, my executive director, Lisa, who I think just had to run, she also teaches a class called Decolonizing Museums at UIC. So it's an ongoing conversation, and it really is a decolonizing practice. And it is something that is an institutional design that we have to break down, even though it's a newer museum. We still have to break it down in our minds and in our relationships with other institutions and our relationships with people and each other. It's a constant unlearning and undoing of the ways that we're taught to interact, and taught that our relationship, taught what our relationship is to the other. So for me, it's really about designing, just like it is with Artist Bonfire. It's a circle for a reason. It's a cipher, because that's a design that sets us up to collaborate. That a design that sets us up to collaborate is not me standing in front of everyone and everyone else sitting down looking up at me. That's fine for a certain context, but that's not what we're trying to do with that event. And so I approach my institutional work the same way. It has to be designed. It has to be intentional. It has to be thoughtful and creative to get around all of the ways, again, that we're set up to really repeat harmful practices, especially against marginalized communities and individuals.
I'm so happy that you brought up the idea of collaborating and partnerships with institutional types of spaces and that power dynamic and what that looks like. I definitely wanted to talk to you all about what that looks like in working with the partnership with an institution and doing such community-based work. Oftentimes there can be like a lot of red tape, or the work can be altered in some sense, or you have to advocate for certain things. I would love to hear any feedback about your experiences working with institutional types of spaces, if you have.
Are we calling them out now?
Yeah,
Or
no, we don't have to. There's too much going on with all these institutions. But yeah, I would love to like just see how you all have navigated like that sphere of like working in tandem. I know that William, you did a residency with the Home and Square in North Lawndale. Like, what was that like working with community? Because North Lawndale's School of the Art Institute is a satellite location for the school. I know I've worked with them as well. I was one of their resident artists, but I was very conscious about making sure that the West Side was at the forefront and the community was at the forefront of the work, especially in an area like the West Side, which is so swept under the rug or forgotten about in certain senses. Yeah. So yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
I mean, the first thing was that, trying to figure out who's doing work in the neighborhood already, right? And trying to figure out how to, if there's any resources, right? Like, how do those resources go to support the work already happening, right? And then, specifically at Home and Square, like I know UCAN was already doing work in North Lawndale, right? They were partnering specifically with the park districts and UCAN and urban gateways, right? We're already having these workshops and these like cookouts, which were like really beautiful, like in the evenings on like Fridays, Saturdays, Thursdays, Wednesdays, so trying to figure out who was already doing the work and then approaching them to see like, hey, this is, I'm doing this residency, right? Part of the residency is like for me to, do these workshops in neighborhoods, would would you be interested, right, in having me participate as part of the work that you're already doing? And if so, right, like what could my role be, right? So it complements what you're already doing. So it doesn't also like my presence doesn't disrupt what was already happening, right? In that case. Um, so I think part of it is like just also like recognizing who's doing the work and trying to figure out like, hey, these are the resources that I have, right? Like this is my expertise, right? This is what I'm trying to ask from this opportunity, right? Like is it something that you're interested in, right? And then trying to do that. But most of my workshops happen out of home and square, although the radical, like the radical print shop project, which is another project that I have, was started at home and square. Like that idea of inviting folks to learn how to print through this print shop, was initiated there, right? And then slowly develop into other things as well.
Oh, that's so great. And I think that really segues into my next question, really thinking about Chicago's neighborhoods and various communities and projects like the Mobile Art Cart or the Chicago Humanities Festival or working with different queer nightlife scenes. I'm curious about how you've all navigated or approached creating work in tandem with the communities outside of your own necessarily. Like, what does that look like? And I think, William, you touched a bit about that, like making sure that you know who is doing the work already and making sure that you are able to align with them. But I would love to hear about how you do that a bit more in the city as well too. And maybe Tip, you can speak to that because I know the Chicago Humanities Festival would like pop up all over the city and do these large scale events, and it was like this citywide kind of project and like lectures and like all kinds of things that came together.
Yeah, and what was the question? Just like how is that collaboration? Like how do I
Yeah, like
approach
how
that?
do you work in tandem with the communities by working with these
Yeah.
projects?
Yeah, I mean, I think so yeah, Chicago Humanities Festival as an example, and that is something that was the first time that I was sort of doing large scale institutional, like as an institution, as a large institution, doing large scale programming and collaborating with lots of different partners from lots of different communities all across the city, from Evanston to South Shore to Pilsen, and that really happened while I was at Chicago Humanities Festival. So I got there in 2015, and that was actually the first year that they had their first neighborhood, what they were calling neighborhood hubs. So their first day of programming in a neighborhood. So most of the programming previously had either been downtown or on either University of Chicago campus or Northwestern campus. So those were like the three main sort of areas where programs happened, although there were like random programs, for example, like the Music Box, but nothing really, and especially like a community that was predominantly Black and Brown. And so just thinking about a white institution with a long history, 30 years, well, at that time, it was close to 30 years old, yeah. And what does that mean to decide all of a sudden, 25, 30 years into your history that you want to go into the neighborhoods, how to negotiate that, and build new partnerships with communities and present new types of ideas from communities that, you just really hadn't embraced as much up to that point. And so thinking about that in my position really just forced me to think about the complication of that, but also just to take risk and just to show up and be myself and build individual relationships with people, so that people could see me as a person, not necessarily representing this institution, but as a person who is a part of the institution and was hired for a reason and brings a particular perspective that feels useful for people who are interested in having cultural programming in their neighborhood, regardless of who's helping do it. Chicago Humanities Festival has the resources. And so most of the time best practice for me was just going to the neighborhood, first of all, meeting them. Obviously can't do that now during COVID, but meeting folks where they are, having, asking if I could come to South Shore, for example, to meet Val Free, who's an organizer there who organizes residents, and have her give me a tour of, her space. And even though we weren't planning on doing programming there, just to get to know her better, and then to sit down afterwards and just talk about what she would like to see in her community, what kinds of programming they're already doing, sort of similar to, I think, some of the things that Williams was talking about, just what's the creativity, what's the culture, so that we're not just coming and just bringing something that was not really connected at all to the community or the culture, and having a cross-promotional relationship as well. So not only asking them to promote the things we're bringing, but being willing to share the word on things that they need to get the word out on, and really just sort of taking it baby steps, one step at a time. Very small successes lead to, I think, strong relationships.
Yeah, definitely. And I love the idea of like you bringing up creativity and like meeting with people. I would be curious with you, Bun. Are you creating these wearable garments in tandem with the drag performers as well? Like, do you approach them with an idea and kind of work together, or what does that process look like for you?
It really works both ways in relation to the conversation over the last few minutes, and as someone who's only lived in Chicago for 5 years, it's like, I know that like I am someone who came here from out of the city, young, white, queer artist, which is usually the picture of how gentrification starts in a neighborhood. So thinking about that, I'm very cautious about how I work with people, how those relationships start, and what kind of space I take up in the drag and queer arts community. So usually the collaborations start when someone reaches out to me because they have a specific idea for a performance or a project, and they either want me to create something for it, or if I have an idea for a project, I try to leverage my practice as a way to create an opportunity to share resources. So I'll sell artwork, or I'll try and get funding and use that as an opportunity to create these small gig projects where I can hire people from the community to come and make these projects with me if it's my own creative vision. And between the two of those, I feel like it's built this really beautiful series of collaborations, and slowly those lines have continued to cross, and the projects become bigger, and the projects become more deeply engaged with this really rich community. Like William was talking about earlier, the further along the style of working goes, the less clear the ownership of the work that evolves from it. Like if someone is running a nightlife event, they want to do a performance, they borrow a piece from something else, what happens to the video that comes from that performance? How do we handle like door money for that performance, or tips from a video? Like was being said earlier, it really goes against the way that we're taught to think about art making and to think about ownership in art making, and that does become the center of the project.
Yeah, and I definitely would be curious to know if you all have ever come into a situation where your presence or your intentions has ever been questioned. I know, William, you posted as a Mexican male, I think I read that in something that you had written about, that sometimes your presence is questioned, and I would be curious, and I think, Bun, you touched a bit about that, about being a white queer artist and gentrification and all of that. I would just be curious about how you all have navigated that and how you were able to kind of get over that hump and create as well.
The truth is, I don't think anyone has ever questioned me in that way in Chicago. And on one hand, I'm really grateful to be in a community where I can show up. Actually, that's not true. I had in one critique at SAIC, I had one professor who was a cis white man ask me why I belonged in this community, basically asking me to out myself and explain my identity to explain why I belong there. And that was the only time in my entire time of making art that anyone has ever questioned my presence. I think I question my presence a lot, and I think that's necessary, but not from the queer community that I participate in.
I think I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question. I was like, I thought I knew how to answer it, and I was like, I don't know. But I think just working at an institution, I've sort of gotten used to being questioned, not necessarily for who I am, but just for the fact that I work at an institution, and institutions, especially right now, are being questioned, and that should be the way it is. And I've also been a part of that as a person who works within the institution, questioning. I think that's healthy. I mean, I think like we just heard an example where it's not, it's actually harmful, can be. But I think like questioning institutions of power or dynamics of power. I mean, the other thing is being from the Northwest and looking, the way that I do, especially in the winter, and like just having the way that I talk, like I've been questioning my Blackness and things like that in certain settings in Chicago. And I think that's just, again, that's like, I understand that as a part of my positionality in terms of power structures, and I own that, and, continue to try to unpack that and do better when I fall short. I think most recently, I can talk about an example of, so our oral history program at the National Public Housing Museum is really interesting. I wasn't as familiar with oral history before I came to the museum, but I think one of the most powerful ways of thinking about oral history for me has been oral history as a collaboration. So the interviewer and the person being interviewed are actually collaborating on this archive that they create together. So it's really a record of the relationship, not just a record of like this person's life history that they just gave. And so I've just been thinking a lot about that as we just had a meeting with some organizers in Minneapolis that were really challenging us to say, like, are you going to stand with us when our public housing like tries to take down our stories or tries to suppress our stories? Yes, as an institution, we are committed to telling the full story, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And that's not always comfortable being in an institution that is committed to telling that full story. But I appreciate that. I'd rather have that struggle than the other one. So yeah.
Awesome.
I mean, I know for, specifically with like the mobile street art car, right? Like the fact that I am a cis, brown male, standing in a corner, trying to interact with other men, trying to interact with children, trying to interact with women. I definitely, my presence in those spaces, I definitely want to be questioned, and thinking about, what are the assumptions that we make of people's bodies, right? What are the assumptions that we make about who belongs in spaces and who doesn't belong in spaces, right? What are the assumptions that we have of, who gets to interact with who. And as far as like the projects themselves, like there's definitely been multiple times where my presence has been questioned, where the project itself, right, like with a mobile street art cart, right, and thinking about like why I'm doing the work that I'm doing, right, and what do I get out of it, whether I'm attempting to sell something, right? And you know, there's this constant dialogue with people about the importance of art and art making in brown and black and or marginalized communities, right? And the importance of it existing in those spaces. Because you know, they will ask, is, you know, it's like, well, how much is this, or what do you get out of it, right? Like, why is it free? Like, what do you get out of it, you know? And I'm like, well, but it isn't free, right? Like, your time is valuable, right? And your labor in making this is valuable, right? So like, you are making a choice, right, to spend this time with me and making this work. And because you're making that time and you know, an effort in doing that, like, that's why you get this work that you create, because you made it, right? That's your labor, not mine. um you know, and definitely, you know, with I mean, you know, I've gotten the police called on me, you know, because I'm in, you know, corner. I've been asked to move, right? Because they don't want me photographing there, or they don't want me screen printing in that particular corner, you know, and so I move, right? And usually I'll ask, it's like, well, if I shouldn't be here, where do you recommend, right? Like, where should I move to, right? And usually I do, right? But yeah, but I mean, it's you know, the questioning of my presence or the presence of this work. I'm particularly interested in engaging in those discussions, right? Because I think it's important for us to have them. And I think it is important for people to question why we're there, what we're doing, what are our intentions. Um, you know, but it is an interesting questioning, and it's an interesting thing that I feel that I'm constantly learning about the invisible boundaries that exist within communities that are not always observable to everybody, right? Because we all, you know, we all have different experiences and different our bodies are seen differently by different people, if that makes sense, right? So like, understanding the dynamics of spaces and communities and what boundaries exist within them.
Yes, boundaries are so important, I think, in being able to understand that. And I think that this next question about what it looks like to create systems of support, like how has that impacted your practice, or why is that important to the work itself overall?
Can I ask for clarification? What do you mean? What do you mean
Yeah,
by systems
well,
of
like
support?
thinking about like with the work that you're doing, it is very, it can be very taxing working with very
Mm,
many communities, and you're giving so much of yourself, and there's an exchange with the community as well, and you might be holding on to some of the things that come up, whether it be through the open mics and the poetry,
mhm,
or through the types of things that people are writing on like the sheets that
mhm.
you have, William, or working within nightlife. That's a whole nother feat in and of itself. So how are you able to sustain yourself and create those systems of support so that you can continue to do the work and put in that effort?
Yeah, I'll just go really quickly. I immediately just thought about like my work as a mentor and a supervisor, and just trying to model supporting myself. You know, that's, I think that's first and foremost. Like, we have to learn not only support ourselves, but self-advocacy, self-care, all of those things I try to model, and I try to check in regularly with folks, whether I'm supervising them or not, just to show love. Like, that's the way that I was taught, was just like, you know, we're all in this together. It's not a competition. Like, there is sometimes that energy, but I'm just like, really there. I do think that there is also a stronger current of collaboration and of support in our community in terms of like arts and culture. And so I just try to, one, model that, create spaces for it, check-ins and things like that. But also there are some institutions out there that are starting to get it. And I don't know if it's just been like within the last 6 to 8 months, like they're like, oh, self-care is a thing. Like, and also like the NAP ministry. I don't know if you all are familiar with the NAP ministry, but Trisha's from Chicago. Yeah, I see some snaps. Like, I love naps. Like, I do it all the time. And I encourage other people, like, you got to power nap. Like, you got to take care of yourself. So I need you to rest now so you can have energy later for this thing next week or whatnot. Just helping people sort of think about time as something that, you know, we can't necessarily manage it because you can't stop it and like grow it, but you can, you know, do what you need to do for yourself with the time that you have. So that's definitely a big thing for me. And then, yeah, systems, always thinking about creating systems that support the person who has sort of the least power. It's just always starting from the bottom up. It's just like, what does the person who has no power, the intern, the person who just volunteers here every once in a while, like, what do they need? If you provide that person with what they need, then typically everyone else benefits. And so that's usually how I try to approach it.
Yes, I definitely hope you all are taking care of yourself too, and taking that time to check in with yourself. Yeah.
I was gonna add, Bun, did you want to jump in, Bun? Or
No, you go first, please.
you know, Chicago is full of dope people, right? And I think part of it is that, you know, I've definitely, you know, been trying to be more intentional in who I surround myself with, right? And you know, I'm part of various artist collectives or cooperatives, right? Like the Chicago Art Collective, right? Like, you know, there's 15 of us that get together every single Friday, and we've been doing it for the last year. We camp together, we, you know, feed each other, right? Like, we make, you know, we share our stories and we cry together, we laugh together, we drink together, right? And they're constantly reminding me of what love in action looks like, you know, and it's I'm eternally grateful for their love and friendship, right? The Mobile Creative Collaborative with Akil Charleston, Andres Lemon-Span, and Maria Spant-Lemis, right? Like, we're constantly challenging each other and trying to figure out what our practices look like in collaboration, but also, you know, how does our work inspire each other, right? And it's one of the conversations, you know, that we're constantly trying to figure out, right? Like, how to show up for each other and for our respective communities, right? Because we all live in different communities across the Chicagoland area. And then also, of course, like, you know, like my family, right? Like, I have, you know, children that remind me that I ain't shit, right? Like, you know, like, in a very loving way, right? Like, they're just like, I'm just their dad, right? Like, whatever, dad. I know you're doing this stuff in the neighborhood. That's great. But, you know, like when are you gonna play video games with us, right? And it's a constant reminder, right? That for me in particular, like, I see myself as a seed sprouting in a field of flowers, right? Like, there's so much amazing work that across the city, you know, and I'm a student, right? Like, I'm a student of the people that I get to work with, you know, that, like, yeah, you know, and I'm just constantly trying to learn.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. I felt a bit about go play video games with your kids. What about you, Bun?
I think of drag and club, like queer community look making, very much as a survival art practice. There's this inherent support in it because it's very risky to completely transform yourself in this bizarre way, put on 4 pairs of pantyhose and get on the bus. You know, that's a pretty risky act. So to go out in public as this completely transformed version of yourself, drawing a lot of attention, and then being completely safe, is an experience that requires the support of all these people in a public space together. And it's the environment that's created out of all this mutual support. And I think that it's hard to think what could possibly possess somebody to do that if it weren't for the support that you feel when you go somewhere and you are held in this way. William and Tiff and I all are engaged in projects that encourage other people to make art. And I know personally, I always grew up doing art very much by myself. I'm naturally pretty shy, but I feel very driven to create these collaborative works and to try and encourage other people to make, because I believe very strongly that one of the most powerful aspects of art is in the creation of it rather than in whatever you end up with. And I think probably that's something that a lot of people on this call would agree with. And I think that art, as it exists, you know, like as a career or as an industrial tool, there's also a capacity to generate opportunities to allow people to make art that may fulfill them in a personal or financial way, may grant them the resources to keep making art, may grant them the resources to just keep going, living their lives. And I think that's enormously powerful.
Yes, you definitely do need that level of support, especially with the work that you're doing. And like you mentioned with the transformation, especially. For the sake of time, also, as we're talking about time as a commodity and making sure we respect folks' time, I want to give some time for people. If you're here and you have a question, feel free to type it in the chat. I'm going to ask my last question, and it's really about how you take the Chicago out of Chicago. Like, have you done work in other cities, and how have you brought that Chicago mentality or that Chicago community building or work to other spaces outside of the city? But for other folks, think about your questions and put them in the chat, or we'll answer those just up next.
I've really enjoyed opportunities to take my work back to Indianapolis. In Chicago, no one looks at me twice. Where I grew up, that was not the case. Like, there was like more attention than makes any kind of like reasonable sense. So to like bring back the way that I live and exist here, and the sense of support, and to do exhibitions in, you know, where I'm from, is incredibly meaningful. And it always results in me meeting young people who are growing up there, who are like making their way in the world, and realizing that that kind of work does have an impact on somebody.
Yes, it's always nice to go back home and show what you've learned and also bring other people along for the ride with you.
Yeah, I can speak to that. I did actually one time I raised $1,000 and we took artist Bonfire to Seattle, to the I think it's Golden Gardens, something like that. I want to say Golden Gates, but that's San Francisco, some park with a beach. And the funny part was like there were already like people with fires all over the beach. But they had ran out of pits, so we ended up doing an illegal fire on the beach, and it got poured out by the cops a couple of times. We just lit it back and they came back. So that was fun, just like being able to invite my actual blood family and like friends from college and high school, and just to like bring something that really was inspired by my life in the Northwest, because like going camping and doing fires and all of that was like life. And the first time I did a fire in Promontory Point was actually because the only time my family's come from the Northwest to Chicago. We ended up having a barbecue in the park, and did a fire, and that was technically in 2010, the first artist bonfire, but the following year is when I did the poetry cipher. So just thinking about, yeah, it's sort of full circle for me in terms of bringing that particular piece home. And then the other time that comes to mind is just this, so sort of similar story, but this rural college, Trine University in Indiana, which was just like really powerful for me because the students that came up to me were the students afterwards that were the students that were clearly having a hard time on campus because they couldn't find people to relate to connect, especially like older people who they could see, look at, and be appreciated and sort of appreciate their future through meeting me is where I sort of felt. And the fact that I was able to go to that college after coming from a rural college was also another sort of fun full circle moment. But it has always been about sort of the way that I was able to discover myself and my voice here in Chicago, and to own that and to feel that power and to want to share that power with other people. So going to other places has really like been just one sort of way that I've been able to do that.
Go ahead, William.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's you know, I've had some opportunities to take the art cart or the family portraits project out of Chicago, and I think it just provides this opportunity to reimagine what teaching and learning and art making can look like. But it's also a reminder for me, right, of how lucky I am to be in Chicago, right? Like how lucky I am to be surrounded by like such, you know, intelligent and inspiring, you know, people. You know, but it's also an opportunity to challenge, right? Like to challenge where art making takes place, where, you know, who is an artist, right? And who claims spaces, you know, for art making, you know. And I know those are the pieces that I'm particularly, you know, curious about and excited about, and very much like, you know, Tiff was saying, you know, it's like it's this reminder for folks in you know, like I've gone to Nebraska, I've done some work in Mexico as well, and Ohio and Vermont, and it's this reminder, right, that, you know, these creative interruptions or disruptions to, you know, quote unquote, like normalcy, you know, can generate a lot of discussions that people want to have but don't know who to have them with sometimes, right? And I think the spaces that we're all, and I don't want to speak for Bun or Tiff, you know, but I feel that the spaces that we all create within our art practice, you know, very much to Bun's point earlier, you know, like we're creating these spaces for people to feel at home, you know, even if it's momentarily, right? And to be reminded, right, that their stories, their experience is important.
Yes, and your work is also important. Like, thank you all so much for sharing space and time and for doing the work that you all are doing within the communities in Chicago. Wanted to make sure I took some time. Does anyone have any questions? I know, Travis, you had asked about questions earlier. If anyone has any, feel free to unmute yourself or type in the chat before we close out. Give it some time. Anybody? I know we've covered a lot tonight. Yes. I don't think we have any questions, but thank you all so much for just sharing this space with us. And I really, really appreciate each and every one of you and the work that you're doing. And I'm very, very grateful to have been in conversation and to have brought you all together for such a meaningful and crucial conversation as well, too. And thank you everyone for attending tonight. Really grateful for you for spending your evening with us. If you haven't had a chance to see our ground floor exhibition or any of our other 2 exhibitions, we have 3 new shows that have opened. We have our ground floor show, we have Cecil McDonald Jr. show, and we also have our teen showcase as well. I'm going to drop a link in the chat. We're open by appointment only or by RSVP, so people can come and check those shows out. And that link is right there. So hopefully we'll see you at the Art Center soon. William Estrada is also one of our resident artists in the building. We'll be doing a program with him coming up soon, and hope to see you all out in the streets sometime as the weather is nicer and we're able to convene in some distance ways. I'm looking forward to going to an artist bonfire this summer. So definitely.
Time.
yes.
It's time. Also, shout out William as a former NPHM Artists as Instigator. I'll be hitting you up about that. We want to bring all the Artists as Instigators together to keep working with y'all. So shout out to you too.
Yes.
And Bun, I love your work as well.
Yes, I love it. I love creative interruptions and disruptions. I wrote that down.
Yep, I wrote that down too.
Thank you, Bun. Thank you, Tiff. This was
Yes.
amazing, y'all. Like, I wish we could just, can we do this like every week where we just who do we want to learn from, right? Like, and just bring artists and be like, let's just listen and be in.
It's so lovely. This entire symposium has been really fruitful, I think, just to stimulate these types of conversations, but to bring artists in conversation with one another, people that who wouldn't necessarily have been, or completely different practices. So maybe we're onto something there. So the symposium that never ends, we'll think about it. But thank you all so much. Have a good evening. We'll see you all soon.
Thanks, Ciera.
Cheers.
Thank you, Bun. Thank you, Tiff.
What an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ciera.
Thanks.